Okay, I'd like to sort of begin the second Rituparna Ghosh Memorial Lecture by welcoming you all once again. And it happens to be, like many of you may know, Rituparna Ghosh's birthday today, which is August 31st, which is the day we choose to hold the memorial lecture every year. The lecture was instituted last year in 2014, and this is the second edition of the lecture. Uh, we had Flavia Agnes, eminent scholar and legal rights activist, as a speaker for the first lecture. The Rituparna Ghosh Memorial Lecture was instituted to honor the personality of Rituparna Ghosh, the outspokenness, the courage that Rituparna displayed to very often provocatively and sometimes controversially express his views against a lot of the prevailing social orders. It is that spirit which we hope to uphold through these lecture series, which is an annual lecture series. Values around gender equity, basically around issues of justice. We all remember Rituparna as a filmmaker, but for many of us, there are other connotations and other layers to that person that Rituparna Ghosh was. I mean, it's difficult to speak of him in the past tense still for many of us for various reasons. So I will sort of not dwell upon that. A bit about Protoy. Protoy is an organization that works around gender justice and gender equity. And the focus of our work is on transgender women's human rights, around sexualities, conversations around sexualities, and looking at sexualities broadly, connecting it with other rights struggles, the intersections of class, caste, religion, ethnicity, etc. So in this work, we collaborate very closely with a feminist resource center in the city known as Shanhita. Again, an organization whose vision is around gender justice. We have been collaborating for a number of years in the past, and this lecture is a part of that collaborative initiative. It gives me a lot of pleasure to invite Nivedita Menon here today. Nivedita I was seeing her, she was sitting behind and she was chatting with many old friends with who she had caught up, and she said, like, why can't we not have the lecture, and why can't we just have a chat? And we'll perhaps have a chat, we'll have a conversation, and that is perhaps important to have that kind of conversation. So Nivedita is here today. Many of you, practically all of you, in fact, from the email responses, from the registrations that we had, we sort of knew that people were eager to come and have that conversation with you. But it's going to be a very different format. And so, I mean, though she requires no formal introduction, I would have to introduce Nivi, if I may call you Nivi. Like, we've been sort of used to call you Nivi. Nivedita teaches at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She's a professor of political science. And she is a friend and she's part of the struggle for justice, especially for many of us who are part of the queer rights movements in this country. And she is an ally, she's a partner, she has participated in many of these struggles and has written about the issues. Nivedita also writes on current issues in a range of journals and on blogs, in newspapers. She's a commentator, she's a speaker. So we are very, very privileged to have you amongst us today, Nivedita. And she is going to speak of, let me introduce the topic, What is I? The Changing Selves and Sexualities, which would be a series of stories about sexuality and the self through the reading of different kinds of autobiographies and biographies, and the telling of some stories which are some her own. And these stories will reveal a fluid and historically variable sexuality. Let us locate this self, which is provisionally located at the intersections of communities, nations, histories, and times. Nivedita, may I welcome you to, yes, please. May I welcome you to come and
thank you so very much. The honor is mine. When I got the email asking me, when Anindya wrote to me asking if I would speak at this event that commemorates one of the most creative filmmakers of our age, I was very excited. I'm deeply honored. I will never forget that shock of excitement when I saw Dahan. And I thought, people are making films like this. And of course, we know that Rituparno went on to make more and more complex and challenging films. It's a tremendous loss for us that he's no longer with us, but we are privileged that we shared the same historical moment as him. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to honor Rituparno. What I thought I'd do today is think about what is this thing called I, what is the self, changing selves and sexualities. And the idea is that I would tell a series of stories. Since I can see a lot of friends, I know that some of these stories will be familiar to you. I hope you will bear with me when the stories are familiar, and I hope there will be a new story for, at least one new story for everybody. I will prefer to just simply read the paper because otherwise I might not keep to time. What is this thing that we now call self? It has been argued by Sri Lankan anthropologist Gananath Obesekere, among others, that we need to make a distinction between person and self. The category of the person, that is the idea of the human actor, as a carrier of roles, rights, and responsibilities, is not an innate idea, but a social creation that has long and multiple histories differing across time and space. The idea of the self, on the other hand, implies a gradual progression, a growing up, as it were, to the status of individual, a process naturalized across various discourses in the course of modernity, discourses of law, modern religion, philosophy, psychoanalysis, in such a way that in the modern world, this process of individuation is actually experienced by people as something real or as a frustrated inability to become that proper individual. This assumed natural process of growth towards the proper individual self is distinctive to Western modernity. The key notion central to Western modernity that enables the common sense assumptions that I just outlined was the putting in place of the notion of the individual, that I am this body and that myself stops at the boundaries of my skin. Although this seems an entirely natural identification to the modern mind, it is in fact only about 500 or 600 years old and has specific cultural moorings in the experience of the West. In non-Western societies, this notion of the individual, separate from all other individuals as the unit of society, is still not an uncontested one. At every level in non-Western societies, including ours, there remains a sense of self that is produced at the intersection of individuated bodies and collectivities of different sorts. Individuation, therefore, the process of recognizing oneself primarily as an individual, is always a process that continues. It's in the present continuous in our parts of the world. It is against this backdrop that we must ask the question, was sex or gender a universally relevant criterion of social differentiation at all? That is, did all societies at all times and in all places make male-female distinctions that sustain themselves over stable bodies? This question is raised frontally by Nigerian scholar Oyeronke Oyebumi, who challenges the universality of gender as a social category. She argues that Western anthropologists, even feminists, failed to understand African society in its own terms because they assumed that gender identities and hierarchies were universal. Oyebumi argues that the emergence of patriarchy as a form of social organization in the West is rooted in particular assumptions that emerged with modernity in the West. The gradual privileging of gender difference as the primary difference in society and locating this difference in certain visual cues. For example, blue for boys, pink for girls. Now, this principle, as it emerged in the West, has a surprising history, by the way. Until the middle of the 20th century in the West, for instance, pink was the color for boys and blue for girls. At that time, it was argued that pink is better for boys because it's a close relative of red, a fiery, manly color. And blue was pure and gentle, and it was for girls because of the frequent depiction of the Virgin Mary in blue. It's only in the mid-20th century that the opposite color coding began to appear natural. Oyebumi makes the radical suggestion that gender as a category did not operate in any significant way in pre-colonial Yoruba and many other African cultures. Oyebumi argues through her own work among the Yoruba that seniority was the defining axis of hierarchy, not gender. Seniority is not based only on chronological birth order, but on interrelationships established through marriage. We know this very well, like in our societies. But what this means is that seniority is always relative and context dependent, depending on who is present in any given situation. This also we know. Yoruba language is gender-free. Yoruba names are not gender-specific, and nor are the words oko and aya usually wrongly translated into English as husband and wife, and the terms for ruler too are gender-free, although translated into English as king. Gender then was not the relevant category to understand power relations among pre-colonial Yoruba. We find this among other African scholars who have done this kind of work, which shows that gradually the processes of colonial interventions made African societies legible to Europe in its own terms. Similarly, in Native American culture, before the Europeans came to the Americas, two-spirit referred to people who were considered gifted because they carried two spirits, that of male and female. It is told in ancient artifacts that women engaged in tribal warfare and married other women, and there were men who married other men. These individuals were looked upon as third and fourth genders and were honored and revered. Two-spirit people were often the visionaries, the healers, the medicine peoples. This type of identity has been documented in over 155 tribes across native North America. Consider the poets of the heterodox bhakti movements in the Indian subcontinent that posed a challenge to orthodox Hinduism. These movements originated in the southern part, in the Tamil region in the 6th century Common Era, and flourished in the north from the 15th to the 17th centuries. These mystics expressed a kind of desire for God that travels through the body and reconfigures it. Their desire was to attain the loss of maleness as power and the loss of femaleness as sexualized powerlessness. Scholar A.K. Ramanujan suggests that the lines between male and female are continuously crossed and recrossed in the lives of the Bhakti saints. They demystified the body and sexuality by dismantling the codes and conventions that sex the body. Bhakti saints turned away from sex in this world, but not from fear or hatred of sexuality, but because their sexual passion was invested entirely and in an entirely disembodied manner in the chosen deity as lover. A 10th century devotee of Shiva, Devara Dasimaya, wrote, If they see breasts and long hair coming, they call it woman. If beard and whiskers, they call it man. But look, the self that hovers in between is neither man nor woman. Ramanujan points out that when women saints like Lalla Ded of Kashmir and Mahadevi Akka of Karnataka threw away their clothes, they are making us see that modesty, which is invested in hiding the body with clothes, is a way of resisting and enhancing sexual curiosity, not of curbing it. It is this paradox that is exposed when clothes are thrown away. By exposing the difference between male and female, by becoming indifferent to that difference, they are liberated from it. Clearly, even by the time of the Bhakti movements, normative notions of masculinity or femininity and inappropriate and appropriate sex had already come into being, against which the Bhakti saints were in rebellion. But considerable fluidity still existed even until the mid to the late 19th century, when the processes of colonial modernity, in alliance with the modernizing nationalist elites, began the process of disciplining it. For instance, when we look at historical work on cross-dressing, male actors playing female roles in theatre and dance in late 19th to early 20th century India, we see that two opposite kinds of arguments were made in order to end the practice of men playing women's roles. One kind of argument said they are not feminine enough. We should have real women playing these roles. But simultaneously, the opposite was also suggested, that female impersonators were so feminine that they could, quote unquote, soil the fancy of men. And this is why the practice should stop. So are they not feminine enough, or were they too feminine? Feminist scholars have shown that female impersonation, far from appearing unnatural, in fact fashioned a widely circulated standard for female appearance and modified codes of feminine conduct. Female viewers indeed were instructed to model themselves on the transvestite actor. A legendary female impersonator on the Malayalam stage was Ochira Velukutty. A recent book on the history of women in Malayalam theatre reveals that when Mavelikara Ponnamma, one of the first female actors of the Malayalam stage, was approached to enact the role of the beautiful woman Vasavadatta in the play Karuna, a role performed and immortalized by Ochira Velukutty, the woman, the supposedly natural woman Ponnamma, was hesitant because she felt she could never reach the perfection of the supposedly male Velukutty's performance. Only when she received a letter from Velukutty, by then ill and bedridden, encouraging her to perform the role, did she feel she had his blessings. Then she said, "Even my voice changed. I became Velukutty and then Vasavadatta." In other words, having a woman's body was not sufficient to perform women on stage. Femininity was a highly coded practice, and these codes were developed by Velukutty and similar female impersonators. Now, this is about performance and how the self, the notion of what is an appropriate male and female self is being produced through discourses of anthropology, through colonial modernity, on the stage, at different levels. But usually one then has to come right down to the question, of course, of gender is in the hormones. And when we come to that, once we start asking the right questions, we come to hear a lot of very interesting stories about how even hormones are really produced. There are narratives and fictions and stories about hormones. So today, for me to say this doesn't sound so unusual, but in the late 1990s, I came across a letter to the medical column of a newspaper, and it was the Asian Age, from someone called a grieving mother who sought advice about her 18-year-old son, whose sudden depression she traced to the fact that his nipples and breasts are bulging out, which disgust him. So the doctor reassuringly replies that nearly 30% of men have, I quote, suffered from what he terms gynecomastia at some time or the other. So the doctor's reassuring her, it's okay. A lot of men suffer from this disease called gynecomastia. In some cases, the cause could be tumors or malnutrition, but this is rare. The most common cause of the disease gynecomastia, the doctor says, is puberty, which is not a disease. It's simply a natural stage of life. Because of the fact that breast tissue, normally dormant in boys, is I quote the doctor, super sensitive to the minuscule amount of circulating female hormones. So these terms it's very important, the kinds of terms the doctor is using to reassure her that this extremely natural condition is at the same time very rare. So it's minuscule amount of female hormones in boys, it's super sensitive. Her son was super sensitive. So the doctor says, look, just check out that he doesn't have a tumor or something. And once these rare causes have been ruled out by an endocrinologist, what should you do? Relax? Be relaxed? Your son has breasts? No. Then you go and get surgery. So now you know that, in other words, nearly a third of the male population can have breasts. And if it is not due to rare endocrinological causes, the condition is perfectly normal. It seems to have no other ill effects than causing quote-unquote disgust. But nevertheless, it is pathologized, made into a disease, and when other serious illnesses are ruled out, the advice is not to stop worrying, but to undertake surgery to make that body conform to a mythical norm. Now, today, when you look at advertisements by cosmetic surgeons, you will see perfectly openly announced breast enhancement for women and breast reduction for men. And I suspect they save money by just transferring the fat from one body to the other. Study of the emergence of hormones as the definitive marker of gender difference, Nelly Oudshoen demonstrates that in Western thought from the ancient Greeks until the late 18th century, male and female bodies were understood to be fundamentally similar. This one-sex model of humanity, with the woman as a lesser version of the male body, was dominant until about the 18th century, when biomedical discourse began to emphasize differences between the sexes rather than similarities. Because of course, if you think about the planet Earth, men and women have 99% more in common than human beings and dogs, for example. So you would imagine that actually we are more similar, among the most similar creatures on this planet. So you would imagine that we have more in common with one, and yet the entire production of the difference between men and women carries on and on and on in such a way that if it's a male kurta, it buttons the other way. You must have noticed. If men's handkerchiefs are larger, women's handkerchiefs are smaller. We produce as much snot as men when we have a cold. So there's a continuous production of difference. The shorter kurtas are called kurtis, like little girl kurtas. What is that? So there's a continuous production of difference. When in fact, when you think about it, we have more in common than with any other species on this planet. So in the 18th century, biomedical discourse began to emphasize difference between the sexes rather than similarities. And from the 20th century, the hormonal conception of the body became one of the dominant modes of thinking about the root of sex difference. Now, Oudshoen points out that if you actually take the hormonal conception of the body seriously, we can break out of the tyranny of the male-female sex difference model. That is, if bodies can have both male and female hormones, then maleness and femaleness are not restricted to one kind of body alone. But the biomedical sciences prefer to treat the presence of androgen in female bodies and estrogen in male bodies as abnormal. In this process, a clear nexus has emerged between the medical profession and a huge multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. All sorts of things are diagnosed as disorders, particularly in women. Aging of the skin. From the time you're 20, your skin starts aging. From the time you're born, your skin starts aging. Aging of the skin, depression, menstrual irregularities, all of these are prescribed hormonal therapy. This pathologization obviously extends to male bodies that react to the minuscule amounts of female hormones circulating in them. I learned recently that lactation can be induced in adoptive mothers, even if they have undergone complete hysterectomies, because the hormones that govern lactation, prolactin and oxytocin, are not produced by the ovaries, but by the pituitary gland, which is located in the brain, which we have to assume that all human beings have. Through a process of preparation involving a hormone regimen and the stimulation of the breasts, almost all women can lactate. Are you sure this is okay? I have a feeling it's echoing more now. Is it okay at the back? And despite following this protocol, some women may fail to. It occurred to me that if pregnancy is not the only condition in which women can lactate, and if the hormones required for lactation are produced by a gland present in all humans, then perhaps lactation can be induced in men. So I Googled it, lactating men. So you'll come across a lot of sites which you should not let maybe 13-year-old children see, but you also come across some very interesting information that there have even been recorded instances of men spontaneously lactating, but in any case, through the process described above, it is possible to induce lactation in men if they want to nurse babies. Certainly the breasts will enlarge, and certainly you will be the freakish man who lactates. The problem is not that this isn't natural, because what's natural about inducing lactation in women? It's the same process. So I've often thought that it's actually not penis envy that is the problem, because what little children see are breasts. And most little boys you know actually have fantasies that they will feed their babies from their boo-boos when they grow up. They have to be taught this is never going to happen. But maybe, a time will come, and a time has come. You don't have to grow up to give up that fantasy. If you want to nurse your child, any human being apparently can nurse a child, not their own biological child. Now, if men can lactate, the opposite of that would be unmaternal mothers. The legendary Indian classical dancer Chandralekha, whom some of us have actually had the honor of seeing perform, was once asked a question in a public interview in New York about whether she regretted not having had children. She is reported to have answered by flamboyantly outlining her breasts in the classic Bharatanatyam style, and she said, "My dear, we worship the goddess as Apita Kuchambal, she whose breasts have never suckled." Through the figure of female deities, powerful in folk and urban cultures till this day from the dim past of prehistory, Chandralekha has insisted on the disruption of the fertility-maternality dyad. For her, the fecundity principle is a mysterious force over time sought to be domesticated into the figure of the mother goddess. She demands, on what basis do you call them mothers, these dynamic figures of fierce power who look so calm and confident on the bull, the lion, the tiger, who wear weapons as ornaments in their hair, who are not at all maternal? The domestication of the fierce, uncontrollable fertility associated with nature into tender, vulnerable motherhood is a feature in the historical development of not only Hinduism, but also Christianity. The exciting question then is what happens to our ideas of men and women if we can think of fertility, maternal urges, motherhood, lactation as separate features of the human condition, regardless of the gender that is assigned to the body. Clearly, we need to reject the idea that scientific facts about the body simply exist to be discovered. Scientific facts are deeply embedded in society and culture. Sex itself is constructed by human practices, and one of these human practices is science. Historian of science Emily Martin draws our attention to the fact that science, far from simply describing natural phenomena, is in fact an interpretive exercise. She shows us how science tells the story of the process of human reproduction in such a way that the egg and the sperm are cast into roles drawn from the narratives of heterosexual romance in contemporary Western world. We are all familiar both with such romance narratives. Mills and Boon is what we read when we were young, but I don't know what people are reading now. I know, 50 Shades of Grey. I do know. But those kinds of romance narratives never actually culminated in the sexual act. But there was the active, energetic hero, there was the passively waiting heroine. Now, what Emily Martin says is that these are the narratives you see in biology textbooks. Active sperm, passive egg. In biology textbooks, she says, the egg is, so these are all from quotes from biology textbooks, the egg is passively transported, swept, drifts along the fallopian tube, waiting for the active sperm to take the initiative and make her fulfill her raison d'etre, like Sleeping Beauty. Once released from the ovary, says a standard textbook, the egg will die unless rescued by a sperm. It is remarkable, says Martin, how femininely the egg behaves and how masculinely the sperm. New research suggested that the sperm's motion is not strong enough to propel it forward, and that in fact the egg's surface exudes an energy that actively draws the sperm towards itself, where it is held fast by the adhesive surface of the egg. Martin points out that even these revelations did not lead to a more interactive view of their relationship. Instead, either the aggressive sperm metaphor continued to be deployed, or another cultural stereotype came into play, that of woman as an aggressive and dangerous threat to male autonomy. Martin suggests that an alternative model is already available in the field of biological sciences that can be applied to the egg and the sperm, the cybernetic model with its conception of feedback loops and flexible adaptation to change. Such a model would enable a reading of the egg and the sperm as interacting on more mutual terms, but that is not how we read about the egg and the sperm. In this context, let us consider a literary recreation of the journey of the sperm towards the egg by an early modern feminist writer in Malayalam, Lalitampika Antarjana. In a short story written in 1960, she envisages the egg as a female deity, the goddess Bhagavati, towards which thousands of anxious sperms yearningly travel as pilgrims, a journey in which only one will find self-fulfillment. The entire story is in the exalted, trembling voice of one sperm. Now, this account too draws on local cultural resources. So the Western scientists are drawing on Mills and Boon. Here, Lalitampika Antarjanam is drawing on Mother Goddess worship in Kerala, but the difference is it's explicitly a creative exercise, reworking the roles that modern science attributes to egg and sperm. Here, the womb is the sanctum sanctorum of the deity, the egg, maternal, feminine energy with magnetic power. Evidently, modern scientists, as much as the creative writer, equally use emotive and locally relevant cultural metaphors to describe a supposedly objective natural process. The idea of personhood and belonging and proper male and female roles has been decisively changed with colonial modernity in our parts of the world. Masculinity, for example, has been theorized for a while now in different ways. In The Intimate Enemy, Ashish Nandi made the argument, which is by now very well known, that pre-modern Indian society was marked by fluid gender identities, a fluidity erased by masculinist British imperial ideology. His reading of Gandhi as a figure embodying sexual ambiguity, his political style incorporating key elements of the feminine, has become very influential. Sudhir Kakar, a practicing psychoanalyst, argues that the hegemonic narrative of Hindu culture, as far as male development at least is concerned, is neither that of Freud's Oedipus nor of Christianity's Adam. And one of the more dominant narratives of this culture, Kakar argues, is that of Devi, the great goddess. So he actually does a very, very interesting reading of a story that we all know, a myth that we all know, in which Ganesha and Kartikeya, the children of Shiva and Parvati, enter in. Basically, there's a fruit that Shiva and Parvati find, and they offer it to the child who will go around the world fastest and first. Now, I'll take only a minute to say that this whole picture of the happy nuclear family with Mr. and Mrs. Shiva and the little master Shiva is actually obviously also a way in which Aryan incursions into the Dravidian South incorporate the fierce black goddesses and the fierce black gods as wife and progeny of the Aryan triumvirate. So that's another story, the ways in which non-Aryan gods and tribal gods and so on become incorporated into the Aryan pantheon, sitting in that very nuclear family portrait kind of a way, right? Anyhow, so you know the story. Poor old Kartikeya hops onto his peacock and circumambulates the world, but by the time he comes home, Ganesha has already circumambulated his parents and said, "You are my world," which is a smart thing to say. Please the judges, right? Flatter the judges. The mother and father give him the fruit. So he won. And Kartikeya was so angry when he came back and found this that he went away and he sat on a hill, and there's a pilgrimage to that hill to this day. Now, what Sudhir Kakar points out is that if you look at this myth, who wins? The person who becomes the autonomous adult, who is able to split from his parents and set up his own establishment, which in Freudian psychoanalysis and in the Western culture is the proper adult. He's the loser. The winner is the son who is able to continue to live in the bountiful maternal presence for all eternity. So what Sudhir Kakar is actually pointing to, I feel he doesn't take it far enough, but I think we do need to recognize that when you look at the myths of a region, there are other ways in which psychoanalysis has to function. Oedipus is about parricide, the killing of the father. Hindu mythology is replete with stories of young men giving up their sexuality, giving up their youth so that their fathers can have sex with young women. Bhishma, Yayati, name it, right? So there is a way in which one of the things that I'm trying to show in this lecture is through these stories is that there is a way in which Western myths and Western norms are assumed to contain within themselves the potential for being universalized across the globe. You say Antigone when it comes to war, and it has to apply everywhere. Or you say Oedipus, and it applies everywhere. But you can't say Draupadi in the same way. You can say we have Draupadi, but you can't apply Draupadi in the context of the Iraq war. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you look at these kinds of stories, you can actually see completely different notions of self and actually personhood. So that self that I began with, the proper individual, that is not a process that most of our societies have actually undergone, and it's not because we failed in some way. It's just a different history. They're just different parameters. So that is another kind of story which tells how the self is the idea of the proper self is actually completely different in our context. What is sexy? What constitutes sexuality and desire can change radically with context of time and space. In the north of Kerala, for example, up until the end of the 19th century, if anyone complains that I'm saying too many stories about Kerala in Kolkata, where every historian only studies Bengal, I will seriously have a problem. So I am going to use a lot of stories from Kerala, deal with it. So in the north of Kerala, for example, up until the end of the 19th century, the norm was that no respectable woman covered her breasts. The historian J. Devika writes about autobiographies and travelers' accounts that testify to the ordinariness of the sight of the exposed female torso. One such traveler, John Henry Gross, wrote, I quote Devika quoting Gross, "To the naked display of breasts, they annex no idea of immodesty, which in fact ceases by the familiarity of it to the eye. Most Europeans at their first arrival experience the force of temptation, but it is not long before these impressions wear off and they view it, as they do, the more obvious parts of the body, the face or the hands." If I said that an Indian wrote this today when he went to the US, it would match perfectly, right? That when an Indian man goes to the US and sees the free circulation of almost naked female torsos, perhaps he feels like John Gross felt in the 19th century when he saw proud Nair women walking around with their breasts bared. With the gradual hegemony of colonial modernity, proper ideas of modesty entered the picture, and gradually upper caste women started covering their breasts, while lower caste women were not permitted to do so. So an important struggle of the late 19th, early 20th centuries was the movement of lower castes for the right of their women to cover their breasts as a sign of dignity. In this context, here is an intriguing story, narrated by C. Keshavan, an Irava leader. Iravas are one of the so-called lower castes of Kerala. So C. Keshavan's mother-in-law related to him an incident of her youth. Towards the end of the 19th century, when lower caste assertions were challenging caste markers such as the enforced bare breasts of Irava women, she got some blouses from her sister-in-law. She was wearing it secretly and admiring herself, and her mother caught her wearing a blouse, covering her breasts and admiring herself in front of a mirror. She was fiercely chastised for being a slut, as well as for walking around in shirts like Muslim women. Scared of her mother's blows, she hid the blouses away to be worn at night for her husband's enjoyment, who thought it looked good and who would come late at night to her like a Gandharv. In a complex analysis, Uday Kumar draws our attention to the way in which the blouse ceases to be a caste marker and becomes available as an object of personalized enjoyment. Now, while acknowledging the significance of the themes that Uday Kumar raises, one must ask, is it so clear that the blouse ceases to be a caste marker? Is it not possible that the delight at the blouse of both the wearer and the viewer was produced by the conjunction of at least two streams of desire? One emanating from the perverse privatizing of the act of clothing as opposed to the public and everyday character of the bare breasts, in a context in which it is secrecy that is sexualized. But surely we cannot discount a second, the desire generated precisely by the thrill of transgressing caste hierarchy in the dark of the night, in the very rituals of producing sex through robing and disrobing. We might also remark upon the fact that for the mother, the sign of inappropriate sexuality was the clothing, not the nudity of the female body, signifying as it did rule-breaking of two kinds, sluttishness, as well as the loss of carefully designated difference from the other, the Muslim woman. Sexuality and desire are dramatically revealed in this story to be produced at the interstices of public politics and private conjugality. Now, sluttishness is another interesting notion in the production of proper selves. So let me introduce you to a controversy in the world of Hindi literature this time around the notion of the slut. About 5 years ago, an eminent Hindi male writer, Vibhuti Narayan Rai, said in an interview in a Hindi journal, which was then later published in Bharatiya Gyanpeeth's monthly called Naya Gyanoday, he said in that recently published autobiographies by women writers in Hindi who spoke openly about their love affairs, so 4 or 5 women writers spoke openly about their love affairs in their autobiographies, and he was a bit disgusted by that. And he said they're simply celebrating their promiscuity, bewafai, unfaithfulness, right? And it seemed that they were competing with one another to prove which of them was the biggest slut of them all. He used the word chinal. The word chinal refers to a promiscuous woman, an adulteress. While not strictly speaking a word used for a prostitute, it is comparable to the looser meanings of slut in English. Bewafai literally means disloyalty, but in this context refers to women having sexual encounters outside marriage. Now, there was a lot of debate about it. Does chinal mean prostitute? Does it not mean prostitute? But what was a really interesting response came from feminist Hindi writer Archana Verma, that she said that the very notion of sexual fidelity is suspect, especially in the context of male-female relations, because the expectation of fidelity is always one-sided. So she wrote this in Hindi, I've translated it. Infidelity was born on the day that natural flows of sexual desire were bound into the legal and formal permanence of marriage. In the process of ensuring male control over progeny and property, women were chained with the fetters of fidelity, unquote. What has happened now, says Verma, is merely that the woman writer has finally broken faith with the conspiracy of silence invoking shame and honor. She plays with this term bewafai. She says, yes, we have been unfaithful to the conspiracy of silence invoking shame and honor, in which she had fully participated, an enemy to her own self. She had participated earlier. In the privacy of the internal courtyard of the home, Verma notes, women have long sung songs that expressed illicit desire, uttered the names of their intimate body parts and their bodily flows, and raged about the violence and betrayal that was their burden to bear. But when the literary form of the autobiography bursts out of that courtyard, it frontally assaults masculinist middle-class sensibilities right there in the public domain. In other words, Archana Verma accepts as a badge of honor the term bewafa, which she takes to mean unfaithful to this patriarchal ideology. But that bewafai is bavafa, or faithful to something else, to a commitment to her own sense of self. The feminist response to being called whore or chinal should of course not be to protest fruitlessly we are not whores, but to turn the insult around and ask, what makes you think this is an insult? We refuse the terms of this insult. Or as Archana Verma puts it, I quote, one day I will hear hurled at me the words, loose woman, chinal, prostitute, and I will turn round and say, and this she says in English, thank you for the compliment. That day will come, and it will be a day of feminist celebration, unquote. Let me now present to you a controversy over a short story collection published in 1927 in Hindi titled Chaklet by a writer whose pen name was Ugr, Bechain Sharma. A charge of obscenity was made against the book, which claimed in its 8 short stories to denounce male homosexuality. Writing about the controversy, historian Charu Gupta argues that the three-pronged attack on Chaklet by the colonial state, the growing nationalist movement, and the emerging high literary trends expressing a new Hindu identity, despite the book's claimed anti-homosexual stance, came about because by speaking the unspeakable, it acknowledged the prevalence of such practices. So the attack on it was also part of a nationalist critique, for the unmasculine Indian male was one stereotype of colonial domination, which Charclet seemed to prove by casting doubts on the stability of the heterosexual regime and on procreative imperatives. Now, Ruth Vanita's reading of the controversy notes that while Ugra claimed that he wrote the book to denounce homosexuality, many readers, both homosexual and anti-homosexual, received from it positive representations of male-to-male sexual relations. So what happens in these stories is that there are homosexual characters who are respectable members of society. They are highly cultured and educated. They are, in fact, Ruth says, the mirror images of the Hindi literateurs engaged in the controversy. More alarmingly, these homosexual men claim Hindi, Urdu, and English literature as their own. They trace an illustrious lineage for homosexual activity from Socrates to Surdas and Tulsidas. So they're always defeated in the debate. But the ambiguity of the book is acknowledged, Vanita points out, by readers' responses divided between praising the collection and protesting its indecency. The significant overarching theme here is the interrelationship between colonial European homophobia and nationalist disavowal of homoeroticism. It's another matter that some traditions that offered space for and even valorized gender ambiguity still linger in practices like men dressing as women to propitiate the female deity of a temple in Kerala, Kottakulangara Devi Kshetram. In an annual pilgrimage, men not only wear women's clothes but use makeup and accessories to please the goddess. This particular thrust of modernity to eradicate gender ambiguity and homoeroticism is seen not only in India but in other parts of the non-Western world. A significant and revealing instance is the fascinating account of Iran's long 19th century by Afsane Najmabadi, who argues that it was the cultural encounter with Europe that produced in Iran the heteronormalization of love and the feminization of beauty. She further offers the stark conclusion that the modernist project of women's emancipation in Iran bore the birthmark of disavowal of male homosexuality. Queer feminism and trans women. What are the ways in which a queer feminist politics can engage with trans women? Urvashi Butalia raises some difficult questions in the moving account of her friendship with Mona, Hijra in Delhi. Mona had been born male, but from the moment she became conscious of herself as a person, she was convinced she was born into the wrong body. I really wanted to be a girl, she told Urvashi. Suffering throughout her childhood for her girlishness, she came into contact with Hijras at the age of 18, and that forever changed her life. She went with them to get castrated, the procedure which you know is called nirvana, after which she felt an enormous sense of liberation. Urvashi Butalia, the feminist, with all the feminist discomfort about notions of some essential femaleness, because every time a feminist hears a feminist who is not trans woman let's say a feminist who was assigned gender female like a woman. So something interesting is happening here, right? There are two completely opposing positions that are being occupied by the feminist assigned gender female at birth and the trans woman. And so the conversation is actually really rich and difficult and often quite actually, often it's quite bitter. So Urvashi, with all the feminist discomfort about notions of some essential femaleness, wonders what was it about femaleness that so attracted Mona. Then when Urvashi's father passed away, Mona visited her mother and, consoling her mother, said she knew what it felt like to be alone without a man. This too, Urvashi found paradoxical, coming from someone who had spent her life rejecting her masculinity, and yet never fully rejecting it, because as she found out, Mona drew on her maleness whenever she needed some kind of clout, a resource that Butalia, Urvashi herself, could never have. In Chitrangada, as we know, Rituparno poignantly complicates the key trans-female idea of a woman feeling like a woman trapped in a male body. And I assume that most of you have seen the film. But Rituparno produced layers and layers of narrative meaning between the body, emotions, desire, and social expectations, such that at the end it seemed that to be any sort of explicit or stable gender is the real problem. This is why I find the term cis in trans discourse deeply troubling, because someone who is cisgendered is supposed to have a gender identity that agrees with their societally recognized sex. This is the definition you will find of cisgender. Non-trans feminists are termed cis women. But feminist politics and philosophy has always been about troubling this supposedly natural agreement between assigned sex and gender identity. And we have tried to demonstrate that the identification is deeply learned through coercive and hegemonic social processes. It seems that one kind of trans politics has now produced feminist cis women as the enemy, and I think those who are following these kinds of debates in the social media, particularly after Kris Jenner came out as, she went through the process and became a woman. If you look at those kinds of debates, those of us who have been watching that, it seems that a certain kind of trans politics has now produced feminist cis women as the enemy, just when we seem to have reached the understanding that it is modern discourses of gender, or in other words, heteropatriarchal processes of gendering that produce human beings as exclusively men or women. In other words, feminism requires us to recognize that women is neither a stable nor a homogeneous category. So I really resist the use of the term cis. And it's worth, if there's time, we can discuss it. So if women is neither a stable nor a homogeneous category, just as, of course, race, caste, and class are not stable and homogeneous categories. The most liberating notion of trans that I recently came across was in the narratives collected by the Bombay group Labia, which some of you may have seen, in which a range of people talk about experiencing their sexuality in fluid ways, not just with reference to another, the object of their desire, but with reference to their own notions of self and body. So it was interesting for me that they move way beyond the notion of continuum, which has fixed ends. But fluid sexuality and fluid notions of the body imply an ability to reconceptualize the territorial barbed wire borders of our assigned sex-gender configurations, an ability that all of us could access if we allowed ourselves that dizzying freedom. Going back in conclusion to Gananath Obesekere, the self-evident nature of the self, then, is a very provincial idea originating from the core of Western thought since Descartes. Even Freud, Obesekere points out, who deconstructed the Cartesian primacy of consciousness, did not question the self-evident nature of the self. Normally, wrote Freud, there is nothing of what we are more certain than the feeling of our self, of our ego, unquote. But, says Obesekere, for a Buddhist mortal, that is not so easy, for the fundamental tenet of that doctrine is that of anatta, or no self. He quotes from the teachings of the Buddha, Obesekere quotes, "Consider all substances. Can you find among them any enduring self? Are they not all aggregates that sooner or later will break apart and be scattered?" Nothing has outlined with such stark immediacy the fact that the relationship between our self and our body can be conceptualized in radically different ways in different cultures than the recent Rajasthan High Court ruling on the Jain practice of fasting to death. You know that it has been termed as suicide and therefore a crime under Indian law. A very interesting piece by Shekhar Hattangari, who has made a film on this practice, pointed out that the Indian law, deriving from colonial jurisprudence, sees the body in Christian terms as a gift from God, while for Jains, the body is a prison from which the evolved soul tries to escape. So nothing outlines with such starkness today in the 21st century the fact that the self residing in the body is not something that is easily understandable across cultures, across time, across space. The empirical self, Obesekere concludes, is an illusion composed of fragments that sooner or later will break apart and be scattered. If we conceive of the self as fragments that scatter, that continuously reassemble in various unpredictable, effervescent, disturbing, glorious ways, then everything, including our politics, is radically transformed. This sense of personhood, of multiple possibilities of selfhood, would, of course, in an ideal queer feminist multiverse, go beyond the merely human, embracing non-human nature, machines, cyberspace, as feminists for long have dreamed. A recent, last year's Booker, on the Booker shortlist, was a book by Karen Joy Fowler called "We Were Completely Beside Ourselves." It was a stunning, destabilizing, heartbreaking novel about human, non-human love and intimacy. And she says there, I'm unclear about the definition of person the courts have been using. Something that sieves out dolphins but lets corporations slide on through. Let me end now with sections of a poem by a young feminist Pakistani poet, Kaila Pasha, in which she reflects on the incommensurability between her body and herself. The title of this poem is High Noon and the Body. My body doesn't like me. It's broken out in hives. I don't know when my body fits and when it doesn't. My body lives its life so well, a steady 8 inches away from me, that I'm beginning to wonder if it's ever coming home and learning how it says no. My shoulders hurt from carrying this head, and my eyes wish they could stick to watching fish in a pond sometimes, rather than watch sultry lines on women and then try to forget. My feet want to dance, my fingers want to shoot, my lips to part, and my chest to sing how much I love you, my beloved drummer woman tied around my neck, my God, my four-letter word, my breath, my breast, my cunt, my hair, my knees, my head. High noon on an updraft. Where on earth have you been? Thank you.
I never asked you something because I just speechless. Some question arose that time. The Gandharvas, the 8 types of Vivaha in Gandharvas, and you call Chinals and Mallikarjuna. I knew the all conceptualized according to in myself, or otherwise it's not. In my ritualities theory or Vedic hymn, that is very called a clear picture and motion, numerical, quote unquote, the data. The MSW course is not very, they're very hard, they're very cold, they're justifying. But you are the very good researcher, because researcher, they're not just halt in the station.
Thank you.
Researcher always moving around the world. Thank you.
Is there any?
Since you are talking about Gananath Obesekere, I'm reminded of a very interesting, that book by him. What is it? What is the name of the book? I can't remember the name. But what is interesting is that in the whole context of the LTTE coming up in Sri Lanka, there has been a lot of reflections on how masculinities have been constructed within Sri Lankan society. And there is a very interesting observation by Gananath Obesekere, and later it was taken up by Gianni De Silva, where both of them are wondering that, this whole idea of gender and certain kind of performative codes of gender, which were very caste-oriented, that was also very much part of Sri Lankan society. And there is a lot of speculation about that how Sinhalese and Tamil upper caste men, for instance, upper caste men, who were identified as, and the term which they constantly use is sedate body, the sedate body. How is it that the upper caste, upper class sedate bodies could harden themselves into militants? And masculinity studies surrounding Sri Lanka is, still wondering that how this has been, this whole idea of a sedate body taking up the performative codes of militant men. And what is interesting is as far as the LTT training camps are concerned, they are looking at, very interesting observations. For instance, films by Shivaji Ganeshan, and then even Bruce Lee films, which they had been watching during that time, and they were reforming their ideas of masculinity and replacing their so-called sedateness. But what happened in the process is that there was a caste collapse. Because for a very long time, as according to Obesekere, as you mentioned him so many times, for a very, very long time in Sri Lanka, men of the upper class and upper caste, they never considered violence to be a way of, kind of taking revenge or whatever it is. That was always considered low caste attributes. And in the wake of modernity, colonial modernity, and how the Sri Lankan ideas of gender and, of course, ethnicity started to change, masculinities were also reconstructed, and there was a caste collapse and gender collapse. And all these happened very simultaneously. So, the self and the body and the self, of course, was identified as far as through gender attributes as well as ethnic attributes. And at the same time, the body was sort of reconstructed to, as if, to reinstate the self. I'm a Sinhalese, you're a Tamil, but somehow or the other, the body was being trained to become that self. So that was a comment I felt I would make in relation to your wonderful...
No, thank you. That's very useful. That's very useful because you've basically shown us one more story of the non-West in which a certain normative violent masculinity was produced in Sri Lanka. That was very useful. Thank you.
Thank you for a very brilliant lecture. I'm actually curious to know a little bit more about your critique of the cisgender business. I teach at a women's college in the US, and we've had some incredible debates about transgender inclusion in our admissions process. And now what has become kind of part of course when we begin teaching is everybody goes around the room and talk and says, this is my preferred gender pronoun, so on and so forth. And so this cisgender business is something that gets quite normalized as the other in an odd way. So I was just curious to know from you a little bit more about your worries and your concerns regarding that.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, because that enables me to air some of my anxieties in what I consider to be a safe space because it is under the imprimatur of Rituparno. My problems with the term cis does not mean I reject trans. So that should be very clear. I am completely and totally a queer feminist, and trans politics is part of that. What I'm objecting to is the way in which, now you might know, I'm sure you know, but many of us may not have tracked the term cis to its original meaning. The original meaning is from biology, when certain kinds of cells or whatever that are arranged on the same side are cis, and the ones that are arranged on opposite sides are trans. So that's the basic meaning of cis. And if you simply look at the definition of cis, then it simply means this: a person who is comfortable with the sex that was assigned to her or him at birth. That is the so it need not necessarily have a negative connotation, but it does if you're a feminist. So what I'm objecting to is not the word trans, but the production of the opposite cis. Why does there have to be an opposite to trans? Why can't trans be one more identity which muddies the sort of binary of male-female? And the more trans people there are, the more it complicates the classroom space. Because every time I speak, I mean, I'm constantly making this mistake that you just assume a sex and then that person corrects you and you say, I'm sorry, I didn't know, I will use whatever term you like. You acknowledge your mistakes, and it adds one more way of challenging heteropatriarchy. So I'm completely excited and thrilled with the presence of trans muddying the male-female binary. I just find it very difficult to deal with the production of some opposite called cis. And what happens with that supposed opposite, is that it just undoes, it seems to me, generations of feminist work which said that people do adjust to the sex assigned at birth, but it is not a natural process. It is not a normal. Identification. You're forced to do it. You learn to do it. You're coerced to do it. You're hegemonized into doing it. So, the moment you say there is such a thing as people who identify with the sex assigned at birth, you're actually undoing, I think, decades of very precious feminist work, which says that we should all start saying actually people assign gender this at birth, rather than saying men and women. We should actually start saying people assign gender female at birth and people assign gender male at birth. But now, in addition, the term cis has come to be used along with, for example, savarna, which you must have noticed in the social media. So then it becomes a full-on attack on privilege, cis privilege, right? So I'm fully aware, we are all fully aware that there are various kinds of privilege we all bear, but I'm not sure that inside the queer field, are we going to set up the enemies inside the queer field? I'm actually very troubled by that. Are we going to look at so-called cis feminists as the privileged ones, when feminists have been trying to Sappho is organizing a workshop, you all know, on masculinities and femininities. This is what we try to do. We try to just produce more and more and more identities. So I'm troubled that there is a kind of opposite of trans, supposed opposite of trans that is being produced, which is a highly regressive figure. And I'm troubled by that. And I think we need to have more of a conversation about that, whether we need that figure at all, whether we need this term cisgender. Why should there be an opposite to trans? There does not have to be an opposite to trans. There doesn't have to be, trans is trans, that's what it is. It's by itself, that's what it is. There are people who want to move from the gender they were assigned at birth to another gender. That's fine. But why should there be an opposite, the people who don't move from whatever gender? So I think this production of the opposite it's congealing gender difference in a very troubling way. That is my sense. I know it's perhaps not very wise to do this, but I felt it had to be done. Yeah.
Actually, can I just say, add one sentence to your concern? Like, I also feel a little bit uneasy regarding this cis privilege. So what cis privilege this cis women or men are getting, are they really wanting those privileges? So it is assumed that this person, incidentally, who is accepting his or her gender assigned at birth, and for that, what he or she is getting as privilege is really a privilege to that person. So I am little bit uneasy regarding this.
I completely agree, Akanksha. I completely agree. That thing that is called privilege is what we are rejecting as patriarchal fetters, in fact.
Actually, I have two things to say. That one is, yeah, I completely agree on when you say that there has been this, within the community, queer community, there is a hatred or kind of cis. There is a kind of trans politics. I won't homogenize trans politics. There are different kinds of trans politics. And there is a particular kind of trans politics which is outside India as well as within India also, where not only cisgender feminists are seen as so-called villains or whatever, somebody against things, but there has been a context to it. Because as far as I remember, I was quite young then. In 2006, trans women were not allowed on the National Women's Movement Conference. So there has been a context to it. And one more thing, it's not only trans women, but also there are certain groups of trans men who are more into, it's not only cis male, but cis feminists, women feminists. They see as their contenders or competitors or whatever it is. I just wanted to just flag it, it is there. But at the same time, your and Akanksha's discomfort with cis gender, I think as far as I have, like the bit I have read about what Susan Stryker and people like other trans feminist authors, especially trans women theorists have written, the cisgender, I kind of partially disagree with both of you, because cisgender has a context to it. When the cisgender term came up, and I'm sure you must have gone through and those texts, that it was from the transgender community. There was it was kind of a backslash which came upon saying that differentiation between biologically born, what we are now calling PAGFB following Labia's report. But there is a context where trans people turned around and say that if we are trans, then you are cis. And there was a context of violence from which the term cisgender came up. And also on trans people by cis people. It's not always feminists or not always men or not always cis, but it's cis. And when we talk, and the third thing is when we talk about privilege, we, in terms of caste privilege also, we don't take up the privilege by ourselves. It's by birth the privilege is there. So what Akanksha Di said, that we are not, whether that is a privilege or not, in terms of, yes, if I am a woman, if I am a cis woman, there is a kind of privilege I have, and there are difficulties and violence which I face. Definitely. But when it is a trans person, there is certain kind of privilege I get as a cis woman, which the trans woman or trans man doesn't get. So there is layers to it. I'm not saying that it is layered. So there is I was a bit troubled that both of you are feminists, I know, but when you are saying that, so I have the discomfort that maybe there is some gap, or there is some gap in understanding what trans theorists in the West. Again, I'm saying it is from the West. Definitely it is from the West. I'm not talking about India, because India, till date, we haven't, quote unquote, trans women feminists, I haven't known. As far as I know, there must be, but I haven't read, or I don't know that they have been writing for a long time.
It's a debate. And all the points you've made are the points, and certain points you've made, Akanksha and I have made certain points. This is the debate. So I'm not going to try and counter every point that you've made. No, I'm just saying I'm not. But I do, because this is the debate, and we've just begun this debate. And it is going to look like this. But the only one major problem I have is when you say that you're troubled that when we express certain doubts, it means we haven't understood. That I find surprising. We are expressing doubts having understood exactly where it's coming from. So at least let's not say it's because we haven't understood. And that I don't want the entire discussion to be about this, but I just want to say one or two things. I completely recognize the privilege of caste. Completely recognize, and there is no doubt about it. But to simply use that as an analogy for the supposed privilege of women, to be what? To be wives. To be what? What is the privilege? That is actually the question Akanksha is asking. To be wives and mothers and to be treated well as long as you behave well. So I do understand that there was a phase, and this is something we recognize, when the women's movement did not take trans women as part of our movement. And we've hopefully moved on from there, etc. And to collapse the violence faced by trans people from the world outside the queer feminist movement and to transpose it onto feminist women is, I think, a problem. There is, of course, but that world is also violent to feminists, to feminist so-called cis women. That world, the patriarchal, heteronormative world, is violent to women. It is violent to all women. It is violent to trans people. It is violent to non-normative men. So that is the violence we all face. So instead of building solidarities, there appears to be some kind of a way in which this term breaks the solidarity. I'm simply saying I articulated publicly my discomfort with this term, having fully understood its history. And I think we need to have serious, open, honest conversations about it.
Hi, Nivedita, and this was wonderful discussion. Thank you for that. My point is that on the premise what this started the discussion about is about the self, about the I. Now, if, and though I find it very contextual about the I, the journey towards self is very contextual, given to, dependent on the philosophies of each place and each land, in the way Shankaracharya has defined self and the difference between person and self, I think it is not identical to that of the Western philosophies. Given to that fact, if we talk about self to be a very fluid identity, whereas person is with many denominations, so how we can't just allow that even if some people are comfortable in addressing themselves as cisgendered. I mean, what's actually, that's again a debate I want to add on to that, is that, so why then again categorize ourselves or stick to identities like that? It is again my question.
If I understood you correctly, you're saying that if cis is not a term with which people identify, then it should not be used for people who don't identify with the term cis because of the logic of the self and the fluidity and the different kinds of self-identification. Something with which I'm in agreement. If what you're saying is, so let's just for the moment put it like this, if what you're saying is that the self is fluid and identification with the I and the body and so on are actually fluid even in one lifetime, let alone across cultures, then terms like cis have to be self-identified. Terms that you accept as, I completely agree with you. Because what trans politics has taught us, and that is something we have learned from, is that I am what I say I am. If I say I'm a woman, if my name is John, you will still use the pronoun she with me. So you learn that. Following that politics and following the ethics of that stance, I completely agree that if someone claims this for herself or himself, that's fine. But why should it be an identity that we are forced to adopt as a marker of supposed privilege when the deconstruction of that privilege is what the queer feminist project has been about, that it's not in fact privilege. Thank you. That was a point I really, this self-identification is an important point. Thank you so much.
I also think that sometimes outwardly people think, okay, cis. But even cis so-called women are, it's not like you're in conformity or in agreement with everything that is supposedly female. I mean, as a gender, I might be comfortable with being called a woman, but I'm not comfortable with all the aspects of gender, all the qualities that come associated with that gender. Some I am, some I'm not, and I'm constantly negotiating them. But then to say I'm cis and I'm comfortable, I'm not. Even within that, I'm very uncomfortable. So how do you... I mean, as you said, self-identification is one thing, but...
No, I doubt very much somebody would go out of their way to say I'm cis.
Yeah,
Cis
exactly.
is usually a term
because I don't think anybody is so comfortable with that identity to say, hey, this is mine, because you're constantly questioning it.
I think even my 80-year-old mother wouldn't say it, because she would say, I've fought this and I've fought that. So cis is never, it's almost never, so that's an excellent point, actually, and that's something we learned from trans politics, in fact.
And maybe just one point, again, that, who names for whom? My question is that, like, who gives you the right to call me cis? I mean, why are we just constantly looking for such names and acronyms and, giving one identity and the other and setting orders for me to follow? Then again, aren't we again, teaching somebody to follow something, some norms, then being again a normative in that certain patterns altogether? So my question is constantly on that point that, who am I to fix a normative? And who am I to obey that? What is the privilege? If it is a privilege in that kind, you say, then it is something very much, innate. But going beyond, as we're talking about the society or something like that, as activists or whatever you call it to be, what is the point? What are we searching for actually? Okay. Is it me or is it, again, a clone? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for your interventions. I would, but I mean, I think this would need a longer conversation, as you suggested, because I am actually in disagreement with you, Nivedita, and that's a personal position. Also from a position of having lived a trans identity, and I'm not for creating silos within the space of movements. And one of the reasons why we organize this lecture is also to sort of break these barriers and walls, because the very first question that was asked to us when we were doing Rituparna Ghosh Memorial Lecture for the first time is why Flavia Agnes? Because the connection between Rituparna's films or what he tended to be, what he became like as a symbol of in the later years, didn't have any sort of connection apparently to what Flavia sort of stood for. So, and this question was asked by like a lot of queer activists themselves in the sense that, so, and we were trying to look for these connections which we felt that there were originally. And which is not to disregard the trans identities or the trans experiences that he was sort of foregrounding, but I think there was a lot of commonalities with other justice movements, other struggles. So I'm coming from that awareness where we understand as trans people the need to connect and not create these silos. And while at the same time, perhaps we would like to sort of reiterate that where we have seen, and I'm not saying that even say, for example, I, as a trans person, am much more privileged given my class caste position. However, we have seen how a certain cis privilege operates over, say, trans experiences, and I'm willing to have a conversation to see how that we can sort of go, because we see ourselves as like trans feminists and you know, within the struggle of the women's rights movements, and we have been part of that claiming of that space in 2007 in the Indian Autonomous Women's Movements, the conference which took place in Kolkata, where we as trans women did sort of claim space and engage perhaps for the first time historically. But I'm sure these engagements and these conversations must have been taking place much before. However, so the point really is that, you know, we really need to examine the question of privilege both ways. And I'm not really seeing, we're not trying to create enemies here and not having like these adversaries as such, but we certainly see how privilege operates. We've seen how certain experiences for trans women, or as it may sort of occur for trans women, to be completely disregarded, or there having been no thought to, you know, how those experiences do inform people's lives very, very intimately and very, very critically. So I think we are very interested to having this conversation on privilege. So with that, may we then sort of call this lecture to an end. And I must really thank you, Nivedita, for taking the time out and coming to Calcutta. There are very important thank yous due. Father Caleb, the principal of the Bishop's College, for allowing us the space to host the memorial. It was a long wish sort of to host it within this chapel, because this chapel has hosted discussions, conversations on sexualities, on understanding of sexualities and marginalized gender identities before. Some of us have been part of such conversations. We thought we could expand on the space, and thank you, we could do that. To Arun Durairaj, the estate manager of Bishop's College again, to all our technical staff and team members from Protoy, as well as Mithila and her team for filming this, and to our partners, Shanhita, again, a big thank you. And thank you everybody for being here and coming with us and staying through the lecture. It's now beautiful outside. It's not as oppressive as it used to be. Thank you for clearing the air, Nivedita.